Good morning, my name is Clay McCrory, and today I will be discussing the Federal Reserve Bank. Before I begin, I want to show you the table of contents and how I laid out my information. I will begin by the introduction, go through the history, the first year of the Federal Reserve, the 12 cities the Federal Reserve is in, the Depression, the recession, how the Fed works, and the different services of the Fed. The Federal Reserve Bank serves as the national bank of the federal government. It serves as a safety net for all other banks. A central bank performs 5 primary functions. It acts as a banker to the central government. It acts as a banker to the banks. It acts as a regulator of banks. It conducts monetary policy, and it supports the stability of the financial system. Founded on December 23, 1913, it was signed into existence by President Woodrow Wilson. The Federal Reserve shows a compromise between two political parties to form a decentralized central bank. The first year of the bank was tough due to the world preparing for World War I. The Reserve Bank Operating Committee built the institution around the decentralized idea of a national bank. 12 cities were chosen as regional sites for the Federal Reserve. Now, these 12 cities are unique and play an important part in the Fed because the commercial banks in the region own the Fed. The commercial banks who choose to be a part of the Fed get to choose the board of directors of that bank. The 12 cities are Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. The stock market crash was the first major test of the Fed. On October 1929, it saw the stock market crash and the country go into depression. 10,000 banks had to file for bankruptcy. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared a bank holiday to stop banks from filing bankruptcy. In reaction to the Great Depression, Congress passed the Bank Act of 1933, also known as the Glass-Steagall Act. This separated commercial and investment banks while requiring use of government securities as collateral for Federal Reserve notes. The economic recession of the early 2000s was also very tough on the Fed. With low mortgage rates and expanded access to credit, more people wanted to buy houses. In 2006, though, house prices faltered and the recession began due to many people not being able to afford their mortgages or the house they lived in. Responsive to the recession was the Federal Open Market Committee decreased the federal funds rate over the course of more than a year, bringing it almost to zero. This was the lowest level of funds the Federal Reserve has ever seen, but by doing that, cutting the federal funds rate helped lower the cost of borrowing for mortgages and other loans. The next section is how the Fed works. Congress determined that a central bank should be as independent of the government as possible. The 3 main policy tools are setting reserve requirements, operating discount window and other credit facilities, and conducting open market operations. The board of directors for the entire Federal Reserve System is called the Board of Governors. The 7 members of the board are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. To ensure a large measure of independence from any one president, the members of the Board of Governors have 14-year terms. The Fed sets the required ratio of reserves the bank must keep to their deposits. This is a power of monetary policy. It lowers the reserves when it wants an increase in money supply and raises them when it wants to reduce the money supply. When banks fall short in these reserves, they can borrow reserves from the Fed through its discount window. The Board of Governors sets the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate charged by the Fed when it lends reserves to banks. The federal funds market is a market in which banks lend reserves to one another. The federal funds rate is the interest rate charged for such loans. It is determined by the bank's demand for and supply of these reserves. The Fed's ability to buy and sell government bonds has proved to be its most potent policy tool. A bond is a promise by the issuer bank of the bond to pay the owner of the bond a payment or a series of payments on a specific date or dates. The figure shows how the Fed influences the flow of money in the economy. Funds flow from the public to individual and firms and then to banks as deposits. Banks use those funds to make loans to the public, to individuals, and to firms. The Federal Operating Market Committee meets 8 times a year. It charts the Fed's monetary policies. It also releases the meeting notes after the meeting takes place to the public, and it helps plan for the future. Key points on the Fed. The Fed is the central bank of the United States and acts as a bank for other banks and for the federal government. The Fed sets reserve requirements and discount rates and conducts open market operation. The Fed creates new reserves and new money when it purchases bonds. It destroys reserves and thus reduces the money supply when it sells bonds. Here are my sources, and thank you for listening to my presentation.